Have you ever wondered why it's so important for there to be physical contact between a mother and an infant right after birth? Kind of like this. An interest in learning more about this mystery eventually led me down a deep hole of research, where I learned that this phenomenon is referred to as Kangaroo Care, also known as skin-to-skin contact. Kangaroo Care is a method that is used to care for newborn infants. It was pioneered in the 1970s by a Colombian pediatrician named Dr. Edgar Ray Sanabria. It was first developed as a solution to the lack of resources in neonatal care units, particularly in developing countries where traditional incubators were scarce or unreliable. The term kangaroo comes from the way kangaroo mothers carry their children in a pouch. Kangaroo Care involves contact between the baby and the caregiver in a method where the baby is upright, with its stomach placed against or prone on the caregiver's chest, with the baby's head positioned over the heart. There are a lot of benefits of Kangaroo Care, both for the infant as well as for the parent. For the infant, it can be better for their vital signs such as heart rate, oxygenation, blood sugar levels, temperature, and breathing patterns. It can decrease stress and crying. It can also increase a baby's readiness for breastfeeding. Kangaroo Care also decreases the risk of nosocomial infections due to the contact with the skin. And recent research also suggests that it can encourage better sleep, allowing for long-term growth and neurodevelopment. As for the parents, evidence suggests that Kangaroo Care contributes to decreased risk of postpartum depression, enhanced milk production during breastfeeding, decreased stress, and increased bonding with the infant. But although all these benefits exist and many more that were not mentioned here, what's really important to recognize is the mechanism behind these benefits. What about skin-to-skin contact or Kangaroo Care actually allows for these benefits to be facilitated? To understand the mechanism, we first need to understand the anatomy of the skin. The skin is the heaviest and the largest organ of the human body, serving many functions. Among these functions is the ability to protect against heat, light, injury, and infection, and to serve as a sensory organ. We often refer to skin as just one layer. However, we fail to recognize that skin is made of many more layers. At its most basic level, these layers can be divided into three groups: the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis, all the way from the top to the bottom. If you've ever taken a Latin terminology class, you may recognize that the root epi means above, whereas the root hypo means below. Therefore, these terms refer to the layers above and below the dermis. The epidermis is the outermost layer and is primarily responsible for waterproofing and protective purposes. Most of its composition consists of dead skin cells that are continually being brushed off and replenished. The bottommost layer is the hypodermis. This layer contains a network of collagen and fat, allowing it to be a good vessel to conserve the body's heat and act as a shock absorber to protect us against injury. Below the epidermis and above the hypodermis is the dermis. The dermis is responsible for providing skin flexibility, strength, and access to blood vessels, nerves, receptors, hair follicles, sweat glands, and infection-fighting cells, also known as immune cells. The dermis is the primary focus of today's discussion of skin anatomy because it is a site of the touch receptors that allow for our sense of touch. To understand how our sense of touch works, we need to understand the role of the somatosensory system. This system is an important aspect of our nervous system and is composed of structures in our brain and body that produce our perception of touch, temperature, body position, and pain, also known as somatosensations. Among these structures are the nerve endings and receptors found in our skin. Receptors receive stimuli from the external environment and transmit them to nerves. These nerves then convey that signal to the spinal cord, which in turn connects it to the brain. Nerves contain numerous neurons and serve as the primary conduit for transmitting signals throughout our body. There's a lot of different types of somatosensory receptors, including thermoreceptors, pain receptors, and proprioceptors. Our attention today is going to be focused on the mechanoreceptors, a type of somatosensory receptor. These receptors play a really important role in perceiving touch, pressure, vibration, and texture. Instead of a singular type, there are a lot of different types of mechanoreceptors. Studies have identified a particular type responsible for the hedonic affective touch, also known as cutaneous tactile fibers. These fibers are predominantly present in hairy skin and exhibit heightened responsiveness to slow, gentle touch, which is particularly experienced during those close social interactions that may be found during Kangaroo Care. Understanding the specific type of nerve is really important because each nerve in our body influences distinct regions of the brain and also operates through diverse modes of transmission throughout the body. Mechanoreceptors convey sensory data and are connected to sensory nerves. These nerves are distinct from the central nervous system, which is found in the spinal cord and the brain. Instead, these nerves are found in the peripheral nervous system, and that is why they are often termed the peripheral afferent sensory nerves. Afferent means that their direction is towards the central nervous system by entering the spinal cord, whereas if they were efferent or efferent with an E, they would be exiting from the central nervous system. To understand how the peripheral nerves from the outer regions of our body access the central nervous system, we need to understand the anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a long bundle of nerve fibers that carries messages between our brain and the rest of our body. It has an inner core housing gray matter with a thick layer of white matter on the outside. White matter contains nerve tracts known as columns, while gray matter is divided into two main zones, the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. Afferent signals enter mainly through the dorsal side, whereas efferent signals go out from the ventral side. Consequently, the afferent signals, which travel through the dorsal side, eventually activate neurons that ascend to the brain. This then facilitates conscious perception of the stimulus. CT fibers require a specific tract known as the spinothalamic tract. This means that the nerves begin at the spinal cord and end up at the thalamus in the brain. The thalamus is a specific region of the brain which is referred to as the gatekeeper, because it acts as a hub for receiving sensory information from our body. Neurons then within the thalamus project this signal to other areas of our brain. Several studies have shown that sensory data transmitted by the CT fibers prompts the relay of information from the thalamus to a brain region known as the insular cortex. How do we know this? Well, countless studies point to this connection. For example, human research demonstrates that the average firing rate of CT afferents aligns with the perceived pleasantness of skin stroking, with their signaling linked to the posterior insular cortex activation. The cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of our brain, orchestrates higher order functions with specialized regions dedicated to specific processes. Among these, the insular cortex has a role in emotional processing, social cognition, empathy, decision-making, and self-awareness. Signals routed to this cortical area undergo integration and interpretation, blending with past experiences, expectations, and contextual cues to form a coherent sensory perception. Conscious awareness of this input can then prompt cognitive and behavioral responses. However, the insular cortex is not the end of the story. The insular cortex has nerves that extend to other regions of the brain, such as the hypothalamus. Often referred to as the body's control center, the hypothalamus is a key structure within an area of the brain called the limbic system. This area plays a vital role in regulating emotions, behaviors, and basic physiological functions. Part of the limbic system, the hypothalamus acts as a bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system to help regulate hormone release and maintain homeostasis. It is also responsible for producing an important hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a peptide hormone that is composed of 9 amino acids. It is synthesized within the hypothalamus, particularly within specialized clusters of neurons that are known as nuclei, including the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei. Research has shown that PVN oxytocin neurons receive projections from the insular cortex. From these nuclei, oxytocin is then released to the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is a structure connected to the hypothalamus and functions as a storage and release site for hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. This allows for oxytocin to exert hormonal actions, which means to be released into the bloodstream to influence various physiological processes throughout the body. As a hormone, oxytocin is involved in something called the letdown reflex, which happens during breastfeeding. This allows for milk ejection from the mammary glands of the breast and also helps to stimulate uterine contractions that facilitate childbirth. However, oxytocin can also be released into the brain from dendrites and cell bodies within the SON and PVN. This results in elevated local oxytocin levels. Specifically, research shows that neurons within the PVN project to crucial regulatory regions around our brain. This allows for oxytocin to function as a neuromodulator and facilitate communication between neurons in the brain. This then allows the stimulation of social cognition, reduction of anxiety and fear, and promotion of reward processing, and also, most importantly, the regulation of stress. While I will touch upon a few of the mechanisms through which oxytocin reduces stress, it is really important to acknowledge that these mechanisms are not exhaustive, and there are a lot of other mechanisms at play that I will not get to touch upon here. To begin, the PVN of the hypothalamus is an area responsible for producing both CRF and oxytocin. CRF is also known as corticotropin-releasing factor, and this is a key hormone that is involved in the body's stress response. Increasing CRF results in a heightened activity of the HPA axis. The HPA axis is also known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and this also plays a really important role in stress. The axis is specifically activated by the release of a hormone called ACTH, which is also known as adrenocorticotropin hormone. This hormone is released from the anterior pituitary in response to CRF released from the PVN of the hypothalamus. ACTH then in turn stimulates the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and cortisol is primarily responsible for the physiological effects of stress. However, affective touch has been shown to increase the release of oxytocin. This exerts inhibitory effects on the function of the HPA axis. Oxytocin decreases the secretion of CRF and inhibits ACTH secretion from the anterior pituitary, thus dampening the stress response. Another mechanism by which oxytocin mitigates the effects of stress is through its influence on the autonomic nervous system, specifically by regulating the balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the system. Within the PVN, oxytocinergic neurons are specialized neurons that produce and release oxytocin. These neurons play a very important role in regulating autonomic nervous tone, projecting to key centers of the brain involved in controlling cardiovascular, respiratory, and gastrointestinal functions, amongst many others. Conversely, CRF neurons producing CRF, originating from the PVN, can also project to these same areas. CRF is known to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, leading to increased heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate, while simultaneously inhibiting the parasympathetic activity, which is associated with rest. In contrast, oxytocin released from the oxytocinergic neurons act to counterbalance the effects of CRF. Oxytocin promotes parasympathetic activity, resulting in decreased heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate, and also fostering a state of relaxation and calm. Therefore, as the activity of CRF neurons decreases, the relative influence of the oxytocin on the autonomic nervous system becomes more pronounced, leading to stronger anti-stress effects. To further build on the evidence that oxytocin affects the nervous tone, research has shown that lactating rats have a decreased sympathetic nervous tone, manifesting as a lowered blood pressure when compared with non-lactating rats. Oxytocin induces another mechanism by projecting its oxytocinergic neurons to various regions, including the dopaminergic and serotonergic neurons in the nucleus accumbens, striatum, raphe nuclei, and the areas of the cortex. Nucleus accumbens is a key component of the brain's reward system, involved in motivation, pleasure, and reinforcement learning. The striatum is implicated in motor control and habit formation, while the raphe nuclei are the primary source of serotonin in the brain, regulating mood, sleep, and appetite.
Additionally, oxytocin's actions within the cortex facilitate the orchestration of complex social behaviors and emotional processes, highlighting its significance in social cognition and emotional regulation.
Today, we have taken quite a long journey. We first began off talking about the role of the skin and how sensations such as touch can be experienced by Kangaroo Care. Then, we eventually talked about how these sensations can affect receptors that are connected to peripheral nerves, which are part of the peripheral nervous system. Then we talked about how the peripheral nervous system is connected to the central nervous system through the spinal cord, eventually connecting to the brain. Then within the brain, we talked about the thalamus, then we talked about the insular cortex and the hypothalamus, and how the hypothalamus plays a really important role in releasing an important hormone and neuromodulator called oxytocin. And then eventually we ended off by talking about the various impacts of oxytocin and how that eventually causes a lot of long-term and short-term benefits for both the infant as well as for the parents.
Although the journey was long, it was not exhaustive, as there are still so many other processes and steps that can simultaneously take place, but we didn't discuss. At the end of the day, each step of the process reveals the intricate web of anatomy and physiology and the interconnectedness of our bodily systems. To test your knowledge of everything that was discussed today, be sure to complete this quiz by scanning this barcode. As for your homework after watching this today, ask yourself how the various organs and hormones and neurotransmitters and processes that were discussed today can intersect with other phenomena that you may know, such as something close and related like breastfeeding to something that you may have never thought about before like ankle fractures. Our body is so interconnected that you may never know what connections you might find. So keep learning, keep connecting, and make sure to hop on over to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed learning about Kangaroo Care today.